The wind that night carried more than snow. It carried the cries of children lost in Alaska's merciless embrace. I had spent 15 years in these frozen wastelands, searching for gold that seemed as elusive as warmth itself. But nothing had prepared me for what I would find buried beneath that white shroud on February 12, 1907. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days straight, turning my world into a howling cathedral of ice and desperation, where even the strongest men prayed, to whatever god might still be listening. My cabin sat like a lone sentinel against the storm, its wooden walls groaning under the weight of wind that could strip flesh from bone in minutes. The mercury had dropped so low that my breath froze before it left my lips, and I knew that anyone caught outside would be dead within the hour. Yet something, call it instinct, call it madness, made me step into that white hell with nothing but a lantern and a prayer. What I discovered in those next few moments would change everything I thought I knew about survival, about family, and about the secrets that men bury deeper than any gold vein. But the 3 small figures I pulled from that snowdrift were just the beginning of a story that would test every fiber of my being. When I first saw them, I thought the storm had finally driven me mad. 3 small shapes huddled together like cubs abandoned by their pack, so still that I feared I was already too late. The eldest couldn't have been more than 12, her arms wrapped protectively around 2 smaller forms, their faces blue as glacier ice, and their breathing so shallow it barely fogged the air. Snow had drifted over them like a burial shroud, and I realized they had been there for hours, maybe longer, slowly surrendering to the cold that claimed so many in this God-forsaken territory. Their clothes were torn and inadequate for the brutal Alaskan winter, city clothes that marked them as outsiders, as vulnerable as newborn calves in wolf country. As I lifted the first child, her eyes fluttered open, revealing a gaze that held far too much fear for someone so young, as if she had seen things that would haunt grown men. The other 2 stirred as I gathered them close, their small bodies, trembling with a cold that went deeper than flesh and bone. But it was what the girl whispered through chattering teeth that made my blood run colder than the wind itself. They killed Papa and Mama at the mine, she breathed, her words barely audible above the storm's fury. Her small hand clutched something against her chest, a leather pouch that she guarded like her very life depended on it. The 2 younger children, a boy and another girl, couldn't have been more than 8 and 6, their eyes wide with the kind of terror that speaks of witnessing unspeakable horrors. I knew then that these weren't just lost children caught in a blizzard. They were survivors of something far more sinister, refugees fleeing through a landscape that showed no mercy to the weak. The wind howled around us like the voices of the damned, and I could feel the storm's grip tightening, threatening to claim all 4 of us if I didn't act quickly. My cabin was only 50 yards away, but in a whiteout like this, it might as well have been 50 miles, and I knew that each step could be our last. As I lifted the smallest child into my arms, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on, my shoulders like a mountain of ice. But something in the eldest girl's eyes told me that surviving the storm would be the easy part. The journey to my cabin became a battle against nature itself, each step forward requiring every ounce of strength I had earned through years of hard living in the wilderness. The wind struck us like invisible fists, trying to tear the children from my grasp and hurl them back into the white void where they had nearly perished. My lantern's flame danced wildly, threatening to extinguish and leave us blind in a world where sight meant the difference between shelter and death. The snow was knee-deep and getting deeper by the minute, each footfall sinking into the soft powder that seemed determined to trap us in its frozen embrace. I could feel the cold seeping through my heavy coat, finding every gap in my defenses, and I knew the children's lighter clothing offered them almost no protection at all. The eldest girl tried to walk on her own, but her legs gave out after just a few steps, forcing me to carry 2 children while the third clung to my coat like a lifeline. My muscles burned with the effort, and my lungs felt raw from breathing. The Arctic air, but I pushed forward because stopping meant dying for all of us. Yet even as I fought to save these children, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking straight into something far more dangerous than any blizzard. Inside the cabin, the contrast between the howling chaos outside and the relative warmth within felt like stepping from hell into salvation. I quickly stoked the fire until it roared with life, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls while the children huddled together on my only bed, their small bodies still shaking from cold and fear. The eldest girl kept that leather pouch pressed against her chest, her eyes never leaving my face as if trying to determine whether I was friend or foe. I heated water and prepared what little food I had, hardtack, dried meat, and coffee that would warm their insides and bring some life back to their frozen limbs. The cabin, which had always felt spacious enough for one man, suddenly seemed cramped with 4 souls sharing its shelter, the walls pressing in as the storm continued its relentless assault outside. As the children began to thaw, their story started to emerge in bits and pieces, fragments of terror that painted a picture of violence and greed in the frozen wilderness. The youngest boy kept asking for his parents in a voice so small it broke something inside my chest, while the middle child, a girl with auburn hair, just stared at the flames with the hollow look of someone who had lost everything. But it was the eldest who finally spoke the words that would change everything. "Mister, they're gonna come looking for us," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious fear, showing a maturity that no child should possess. "They killed everyone at the Copper Creek mine, Papa, Mama, all the workers, and they took the gold, but they didn't get what they really wanted." Her small hand opened slightly, revealing a glimpse of what looked like a map drawn on weathered paper, its edges worn from countless foldings and unfoldings. The other children nodded silently, their young faces grave with the weight of secrets that grown men would kill for, and I realized I was looking at witnesses to a massacre that the outside world would never hear about. The storm outside seemed to intensify as if responding to her words, the wind shrieking like banshees around the cabin's corners, and I knew that nature wasn't the only enemy we would face before this ordeal was over. My mind raced with the implications. If these children were telling the truth, then murderers were somewhere out there in the blizzard, and they wouldn't stop until they found what they were looking for. The warmth of the cabin suddenly felt fragile, temporary, like a candle flame that could be snuffed out at any moment. But looking into those 3 young faces, I made a decision that would either save us all or damn us to a frozen grave. The night stretched endlessly as the storm raged with supernatural fury, making the cabin walls shudder and groan like a ship in a tempest. I kept the fire burning bright, not just for warmth, but as a beacon of hope for 3 children who had lost everything except each other and whatever secret they carried in that mysterious pouch. The youngest ones finally succumbed to exhaustion, curling up together like puppies seeking comfort. But the eldest girl remained awake, her eyes alert and watchful, as if sleep was a luxury she could no longer afford. Every gust of wind made her flinch. Every creak of the cabin's timbers caused her to grip that leather pouch tighter, and I realized she was listening for sounds that had nothing to do with the natural fury outside. I tried to get more details about what had happened at Copper Creek, but she would only say that bad men had come looking for something her father had hidden, something worth killing for. The fire cast long shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls, and I found myself thinking about the isolation that had once been my sanctuary, but now felt like a trap. In the morning, if we survived the night, decisions would have to be made, decisions that could mean life or death for all of us. As dawn struggled to break through the storm clouds, the wind finally began to show signs of weakening, though the snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes that promised to bury the landscape even deeper. The children stirred as pale light filtered through the cabin's single window, and I realized that the relative quiet felt almost ominous after hours of nature's fury. The eldest girl was already awake, studying my face with those two knowing eyes, and I sensed she was trying to decide how much more of her story she could trust me with. Outside, the world had been transformed into an alien landscape of white hills and valleys where familiar landmarks had vanished beneath the snow's blanket, making travel treacherous if not impossible. But I knew that staying put wasn't an option if men had indeed killed this girl's family for whatever treasure they possessed. They would eventually find us, storm or no storm. The cabin that had sheltered us through the night would become our tomb if we didn't move soon, and I had to find a way to get 3 traumatized children across some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. As I prepared a meager breakfast from my dwindling supplies, I caught the eldest girl watching me with something that might have been hope flickering in her young eyes. But hope, I had learned in my years in Alaska, could be the most dangerous emotion of all. The morning brought a terrible clarity as the storm's fury finally subsided, leaving behind a world transformed into a pristine white hell that could kill as efficiently as any human predator. Through my cabin window, I could see the landscape stretching endlessly in all directions, a maze of snow-covered ridges and hidden crevasses where a single misstep could mean death for the unwary. The children gathered around my small table, their young faces somber as they shared the hot coffee and hardtack I had prepared, and I realized that despite their ordeal, they were stronger than most adults I had known in this harsh land. The eldest girl finally told me her name, Sarah, and introduced her younger siblings as Tommy and Little Beth, names that somehow made their situation feel even more real and desperate. Sarah's hand never left that leather pouch, and I knew that whatever it contained was the key to everything. The reason her family had died, the reason we were all in danger, and possibly our only hope of survival. The silence outside was deceptive, beautiful in its pristine perfection, but I had lived in Alaska long enough to know that death often wore beauty's mask. As I looked at these 3 children who had been thrust into my solitary world, I realized that my days as a lone prospector were over. From this moment forward, their survival was my responsibility, their fate inextricably linked with mine. But what I didn't know yet was that the real danger was already closer than any of us imagined, moving through the snow like wolves stalking their prey. The silence that followed the storm's end was more terrifying than any howling wind I had ever endured in my 15 years of Alaska solitude. It pressed against the cabin walls like a living thing, thick and heavy with the weight of secrets and the promise of violence that would soon shatter our fragile sanctuary. Sarah sat by the window, her small frame silhouetted against the blinding white landscape, that mysterious leather pouch never leaving her grip as she watched for signs of movement in the pristine snow. Tommy and Little Beth huddled near the fire, their young faces still pale from their ordeal, but I could see strength returning to their small bodies with each passing hour. My supplies, which had seemed adequate for 1 man through the remainder of winter, now looked pitifully insufficient for 4 souls, and I knew we had perhaps 3 days of food left if we rationed carefully. The cabin, my refuge for so many lonely years, suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable, like a target painted against the white canvas of the wilderness. Every creak of the settling logs made my hand drift toward my rifle, and I found myself listening for sounds that had nothing to do with the natural world. But it was the story that Sarah finally began to tell that made my blood run colder then, the Arctic air seeping through the cabin's chinks. "Papa found something at Copper Creek that wasn't supposed to be there," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible as she continued her vigil at the window. Her words carried the weight of nightmares that would haunt her for the rest of her life, and I realized I was about to hear secrets that men had already died for. The leather pouch in her hands seemed to pulse with its own dark energy, as if the very paper inside it was cursed with the blood of those who had possessed it before. Tommy looked up from where he was playing with little Beth, his 8-year-old, face grave with premature wisdom, and I saw him nod as if confirming his sister's words. "It wasn't just gold in that mine," Sarah continued, her breath fogging the cold window glass. "Papa found papers, old ones, that showed where the real treasure was hidden. Something left by Russian traders before Alaska became American territory." The implications hit me like a physical blow, because I knew that kind of secret could drive men to murder without hesitation. But it was what she said next that made me realize we were dealing with something far more dangerous than simple greed. The children's story unfolded like pages from a nightmare, each detail more horrifying than the last, as they described the morning when everything changed at Copper Creek Mine. Sarah's father, a decent man named William Morrison, who had worked claims throughout the territory, had discovered a hidden chamber deep in the mine shaft where previous prospectors had missed a cache of documents wrapped in oiled cloth. The papers, written in Russian and English, detailed the location of a fortune in gold and furs that had been buried by traders fleeing the sale of Alaska to America in 1867, a treasure worth enough to buy half of Seattle. But Morrison had made the fatal mistake of mentioning his find to other miners in the camp, men he thought he could trust with his life and the lives of his children. Within a week, strangers began arriving at Copper Creek, hard men with cold eyes and weapons that spoke of violence as a way of life, asking questions about Morrison's discovery and growing more insistent with each passing day. Sarah's voice trembled as she described the night when these men finally showed their true nature, arriving at the mine with torches and demands that would end in blood. But what haunted her most wasn't just the memory of violence. It was the knowledge that they had taken copies of the documents while the originals remained hidden in that leather pouch she guarded so fiercely. Little Beth began to cry softly as her sister's story reached its climax, and I felt something break inside my chest as I watched these children relive their parents' murder. The attack had come at dawn, when the Morrison family was preparing breakfast in their small cabin near the mine entrance, the killers surrounding them like wolves closing in on wounded prey. William Morrison had tried to bargain with them, offering to share the treasure's location in exchange for his family's safety, but these weren't men who honored deals or showed mercy to witnesses. Sarah described how her father had whispered urgent instructions to her as the situation grew desperate, telling her to take the original documents and run with her younger siblings, no matter what happened to him and their mother. The sound of gunshots still echoed in her nightmares, she told me, along with her mother's final scream as the children fled through a back window into the unforgiving wilderness. They had run for hours through snow and bitter cold, following a trail her father had once shown her that led away from the mine toward the broader territory, their only possessions the clothes on their backs and the leather pouch that contained their family's doom. But the most chilling part of her account was the realization that the killers had let them escape on purpose, knowing that children couldn't survive long in the Alaskan winter and would eventually lead them to the treasure's true location. The weight of their story settled over my cabin like a shroud, and I realized that harboring these children made me complicit in their family's secret, and a target for the same ruthless men who had already committed murder. My years of solitude had prepared me for many hardships, but nothing had readied me for the responsibility of protecting 3 young lives while being hunted by killers who would stop at nothing to claim their prize. Sarah showed me a corner of the map through the leather pouch's opening, and I could see markings that indicated locations throughout the Alaskan territory, drawn in faded ink that spoke of age and authenticity. The treasure, if it truly existed, represented wealth beyond imagination, but I had seen enough of human nature to know that such riches came with a price paid in blood. Tommy spoke up for the first time. his young voice steady despite the fear in his eyes, telling me that his father had made him memorize certain landmarks mentioned in the documents, creating a living backup in case the papers were ever lost. The cabin's walls suddenly felt thinner, less substantial, as if they were made of paper rather than solid logs, and I knew that our sanctuary had already become a trap. Every minute we remained here increased our danger, yet traveling through the deep snow with 3 children would be like painting a target on our backs for anyone tracking us. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the snow-covered landscape, I found myself making preparations that spoke of desperate measures and slim chances for survival. My rifle cleaning became a ritual of readiness, each bullet counted and recounted as I planned for confrontations that seemed inevitable. The children watched me work with the solemn attention of soldiers preparing for battle, understanding instinctively that their lives hung in the balance of decisions made by adults in a world that showed no mercy to the innocent. Sarah helped me inventory our supplies while keeping watch at the window, her young hands competent beyond her years as she sorted through dried goods and ammunition with grim efficiency. The leather pouch never left her side, and I noticed how she unconsciously shielded it from view, as if even I couldn't be completely trusted with its contents. Tommy proved surprisingly helpful in understanding the cabin's defensive positions, suggesting ways to block windows and reinforce the door that showed a tactical mind shaped too early by violence and loss. Little Beth stayed close to the fire, but I could see her watching everything with wide eyes that missed nothing, storing memories that would either save her life or haunt her forever. But it was the sound we all heard just before sunset that confirmed our worst fears and shattered any illusions of safety we might have harbored. The distant howling that reached our ears wasn't made by wolves or wind, but by dogs, sled dogs whose voices carried the promise of human pursuit across the frozen wasteland. Sarah's face went white as she pressed herself against the window, searching the darkening landscape for signs of the men she knew were coming for them. The sound came from the north, the same direction the children had fled from after witnessing their parents' murder, and I knew that our hunters had finally picked up the trail despite the storm's attempts to hide it. My hands moved automatically to check my weapons while my mind raced through options that all seemed to lead to violence or death, the cabin's warmth suddenly feeling like the deceptive comfort of a coffin. The children gathered close to me, their small bodies trembling with fear that had nothing to do with cold, and I realized that the moment of reckoning was approaching faster than any of us had hoped. The howling grew closer, more distinct, and I could make out at least 2 different teams of dogs, meaning multiple men with sleds who had come prepared for a long chase across the wilderness. Sarah clutched the leather pouch to her chest like a shield, her young face set with determination that broke my heart, even as it filled me with pride for her courage. But as the first distant shouts of human voices reached us through the gathering darkness, I knew that our time of hiding was over, and the real fight for survival was about to begin. The voices carried clearly in the thin air, rough masculine, shouts urging the dog teams forward with an urgency that spoke of men closing in on their quarry after days of relentless pursuit. I extinguished the cabin's lantern and motioned for the children to move away from the windows, plunging us into a darkness lit only by the fire's glow and the pale reflection of snow through glass. Sarah's breathing became shallow and quick, the sound of barely controlled panic, while Tommy wrapped his arms protectively around little Beth in a gesture that showed how much he had grown up in the past few days. The leather pouch seemed to glow with malevolent energy in the firelight, and I found myself wondering if the Russian treasure was worth the lives of 3 innocent children and 1 aging prospector. But looking at their young faces, marked by loss and terror but still holding on to hope, I knew that the question wasn't about treasure anymore. It was about standing between predators and prey, about choosing to be the kind of man who protected the helpless rather than abandoning them to fate. The shouts grew louder, more distinct, and I could make out at least 3 different voices calling to each other as they coordinated their approach to my cabin. The sled dog's excited barking told me that they had found our scent trail, probably the path I had made carrying the children through the storm, and that discovery meant we had perhaps minutes before confrontation became inevitable. As I checked my rifle one final time and positioned myself near the door, I realized that the white silence of Alaska was about to be shattered by violence, and that whatever happened in the next few hours would determine whether 3 orphaned children lived to see another dawn. The first gunshot shattered the Arctic silence like breaking glass, the bullet splintering wood inches from my head as I dove away from the cabin window. The attack had come without warning or negotiation, confirming that these weren't men interested in conversation or compromise. They were killers who viewed witnesses as problems to be eliminated. Sarah screamed and pulled her siblings toward the back corner of the cabin, the leather pouch pressed against her chest as if it could shield them from the violence erupting around us. I rolled behind my makeshift barricade of furniture and supplies, my rifle ready as muzzle flashes lit up the darkness outside like deadly fireflies. The sound of splintering wood filled the air as more bullets punched through the cabin walls, sending splinters flying like shrapnel while the children huddled in terror behind an overturned table. Through the chaos, I could hear men shouting orders to each other, coordinating their assault with military precision that spoke of experience in violence and death. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the wood smoke from our fire, creating a hellish atmosphere that turned our sanctuary into a battlefield. But it was the voice that called out through the gunfire that made my blood freeze with recognition and dread. "Morrison's brats are in there with some fool Prospector," the voice shouted, cold and calculating as death itself. "Take them alive if you can, but don't let them destroy those papers." The speaker's tone carried absolute authority, and I realized we were facing the leader of these killers, a man who commanded others through fear and promised violence. His words confirmed what I had suspected. They needed the children alive to access whatever secrets the leather pouch contained, but my own life meant nothing to them except as an obstacle to be removed. Sarah's face went pale as she recognized the voice, and she whispered a name that sent chills down my spine. Dmitry Volkov. The name meant nothing to me, but the way she said it, with a mixture of terror and hatred, told me everything I needed to know about the man hunting us. Another volley of gunfire erupted, systematically targeting the cabin's weak points as they tried to create multiple entry points for their assault. I returned fire through a gap in the logs, aiming at the muzzle flashes in the darkness, but I knew that my single rifle against multiple attackers was a losing proposition. The children pressed themselves lower as bullets whined overhead, little Beth sobbing quietly while Tommy tried to comfort her with whispered words of false reassurance. But it was Sarah's next revelation that made me understand the true scope of what we were facing. "Volkov was Papa's partner," Sarah whispered through chattering teeth, her voice barely audible above the gunfire. "He helped Papa explore the mine, shared meals at our table, played games with us children, and all the time he was planning to kill us for what Papa found." The betrayal in her young voice cut deeper than any bullet wound, and I realized we weren't just fighting bandits or claim jumpers, but a man who had gained the Morrison family's trust before destroying them. The leather pouch contained more than just maps and documents. It held the evidence of Volkov's treachery and his connections to other crimes throughout the territory. Sarah's father had trusted this man with his life, his family, and his discoveries, only to learn too late that friendship meant nothing when weighed against Russian gold and territorial secrets. The gunfire outside intensified as Volkov's men began to advance on the cabin from multiple directions, their boots crunching through the snow with predatory precision. I could hear them calling to each other in a mixture of English and Russian, coordinating their assault like wolves closing in for the kill. The cabin's walls, which had seemed so solid and protective just hours before, now felt like paper barriers that could be breached at any moment. But it was the sound of breaking glass that told me our defenses had finally been compromised. A burning torch crashed through the front window, scattering glass and flames across the cabin floor as Volkov's men tried to smoke us out like animals from a den. The fire caught quickly on the dry wooden planks, filling the cabin with choking smoke that made the children cough and gasp for clean air. I grabbed a bucket of snow from beside the door and threw it on the flames. But more torches followed the first, and I knew that staying inside would mean death by fire or smoke if the bullets didn't kill us first. Sarah clutched the leather pouch tighter, her knuckles white with determination, as she prepared to follow whatever desperate plan might save their lives. The heat from the spreading fire began to make the cabin unbearable, forcing us toward the back wall where I had always planned an emergency exit but never thought I would need to use it. Tommy proved his courage by helping me kick out several loose logs in the rear wall, creating an opening just large enough for the children to squeeze through into the cold night air. The sound of boots on the cabin's front porch told me that Volkov's men were preparing to storm inside, expecting to find us trapped and helpless. But I had spent too many years in Alaska to go down without a fight, and these children had already endured too much to die in the flames of my burning home. As I pushed Sarah toward the hole in the wall, she pressed something small and hard into my hand, a key that felt warm against my palm despite the Arctic cold. "Papa hid more than just papers," she whispered urgently, as flames licked at the cabin's ceiling above us. "That key opens a safety deposit box in Fairbanks, box 47 at Merchant's Bank, where he kept the real map and his written proof of Volkov's other crimes." The small piece of metal suddenly felt heavier than gold, representing not just treasure, but justice for a murdered family and evidence that could hang their killer. I understood now why Volkov was so desperate to capture the children alive. Without them and their knowledge, he might find some treasure, but he would never locate all of it, and he could never be certain that evidence of his crimes wouldn't surface years later. The fire roared louder as more of the cabin's interior caught flame, the heat becoming unbearable as smoke filled my lungs and made my eyes water. Tommy and little Beth were already outside, their small forms barely visible in the snow as they crouched behind a woodpile that offered minimal protection from the gunfire that would surely follow. Sarah squeezed through the opening with the agility of youth, the leather pouch clutched against her body like a lifeline, while I prepared to follow them into what might be our final stand against overwhelming odds. The sound of splintering wood from the front of the cabin told me that Volkov's men were breaking down the door, expecting to find us trapped inside like rats in a burning maze. But as I squeezed through the hole into the bitter cold, I realized that we had gained only moments of advantage in a game where the stakes were life and death. The cold hit us like a physical blow as we emerged into the night air. The temperature difference from the burning cabin so extreme that it felt like jumping from hell into an Arctic wasteland. Snow immediately began to cling to our clothing and exposed skin, reminding us that even if we escaped Volkov's bullets, the wilderness itself could kill us within hours. I could hear shouts of rage and confusion from inside the burning cabin, as the killers realized we had escaped their trap, followed by the sound of boots running around the structure as they searched for our exit point. Sarah led her siblings toward a stand of trees about 50 yards from the cabin, their dark forms offering the only cover in a landscape painted white by snow and orange by flames. The children moved with surprising stealth, their fear giving them the desperate energy of survival, but I knew that our tracks in the snow would be impossible to hide from experienced hunters. Behind us, the cabin continued to burn with increasing fury, the flames reaching toward the star-filled sky like accusing fingers that illuminated our escape route for anyone with eyes to see. The leather pouch bounced against Sarah's chest as she ran, and I realized that the documents it contained were our only bargaining chip in a game where the other players held all the advantages. Tommy stumbled in the deep snow but recovered quickly, his young face set with determination that reminded me of his murdered father's courage. But it was the sound of dogs barking in the distance that told me our escape had only bought us minutes before the real hunt would begin. Volkov's voice carried clearly across the snow as he discovered our escape route, his Russian accent thick, with rage as he ordered his men to organize pursuit. "Spread out and find their trail," he commanded, his words sharp as breaking ice. "The children cannot have gone far in this cold, and the old man will slow them down." I could hear at least 4 different voices responding to his orders, meaning we faced overwhelming odds in a landscape that offered little shelter and no allies. The burning cabin cast dancing shadows across the snow, creating a hellish light. That made it difficult to judge distances or spot potential ambushes. Sarah and her siblings pressed against the trunk of a massive pine tree, their small bodies shivering from cold and terror as they waited for my signal to continue our desperate flight. The key she had given me felt like ice in my pocket, but I knew it represented hope. If we could somehow reach Fairbanks alive, we might find allies and evidence that could bring justice for the Morrison family. The sound of breaking branches and heavy footsteps told me that Volkov's men were beginning their search in earnest, spreading out like wolves to cover more ground and cut off our escape routes. I checked my rifle and counted my remaining ammunition, knowing that every bullet would have to count in the battles ahead. But it was the distant howling of wind through the mountains that reminded me we faced more than human enemies. The Alaska wilderness itself was hunting us, and it showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. The pursuit began in earnest as we heard the first shouts of discovery from behind us, telling me that our tracks had been found despite our attempts at stealth. We pushed deeper into the forest, following what might have been an old game trail that led away from the burning cabin and toward the uncertain safety of the deeper wilderness. Sarah proved surprisingly capable in the snow, her young legs finding purchase where adults might stumble, while Tommy helped support little Beth when the drifts became too deep for her shorter stride. The leather pouch swayed with each step, a constant reminder of the burden we carried and the price that had already been paid for its contents. Behind us, the voices of our pursuers grew more organized and methodical, spreading out to cover potential escape routes with the efficiency of men who had hunted human prey before. I could hear Volkov calling instructions in Russian to his men, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command and violence. The forest around us seemed to close in, the dark trees offering concealment, but also creating a maze, where we could easily become lost and freeze to death before dawn. Every snap of a branch or crunch of snow beneath our feet sounded impossibly loud in the stillness, as if the very wilderness was conspiring to betray our location to the killers. Behind us, but it was the sight that greeted us when we reached a small clearing that made me realize our flight had led us into something far more complex than a simple chase through the woods. In the center of the clearing stood the remains of what had once been a substantial expedition camp. Canvas shelters collapsed under the weight of old snow, supply crates scattered and broken, and the blackened circle of a fire pit that had been cold for months or possibly years. Sarah gasped as she recognized something among the debris, pointing toward a wooden sign that bore Russian lettering and the unmistakable double-headed eagle of the old imperial seal. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We had stumbled upon the lost expedition mentioned in the Morrison documents, the Russian traders who had hidden their treasure before Alaska's sail to America. The children stared at the scene with a mixture of awe and terror, understanding that they were looking at the graves of men who had died protecting the same secret that now marked them for death. Scattered among the ruins were personal effects that spoke of a desperate final stand, broken weapons, torn clothing, and bones that gleamed white in the moonlight filtering through the forest canopy. Tommy found a leather-bound journal half buried in the snow, its pages frozen but still legible, containing entries written in both Russian and English that documented the expedition's final days. The last entry, dated March 15, 1867, described the approach of hostile forces and the decision to bury the treasure rather than let it fall into the wrong hands. But it was Sarah's strangled cry of recognition that drew my attention to the most chilling discovery of all. A wooden cross bearing the name Dmitry Volkov, and marking what appeared to be an empty grave. The empty grave bearing Dmitry Volkov's name stared up at us like an accusation from beyond death. The wooden cross weathered but still legible in the pale moonlight that filtered through the forest canopy. Sarah's face went white as bone as she read the inscription, her young mind struggling to comprehend how the man who had murdered her parents could share a name with someone buried 40 years earlier in this forgotten expedition camp. The wind began to pick up again, carrying with it the promise of another storm that would either hide our tracks or bury us alive in the wilderness. While behind us, the voices of our pursuers grew closer with each passing minute. Tommy clutched the frozen journal he had found, its pages crackling like ice as he tried to read entries that might explain the connection between past and present, between Russian traders and modern-day killers. The ruins around us seemed to whisper with the voices of dead men, their bones scattered among the broken supplies and collapsed shelters that marked their final desperate stand against enemies who had found them even in this remote wilderness. Little Beth pressed close to my side, her small body trembling with cold and fear as she sensed the evil that permeated this place like a curse that stretched across decades. The leather pouch that Sarah guarded so fiercely suddenly felt heavier, with the weight of history and blood representing not just treasure but a legacy of violence that had been passed down through generations of greed and betrayal. But it was the sound of approaching footsteps that forced us to make a decision that would determine whether we joined the bones already bleaching in this Arctic graveyard. "They're close," Sarah whispered, her breath forming clouds of vapor that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. The voices of Volkov's men could be heard clearly now, speaking in hushed tones as they coordinated their search through the forest, their words carrying the confidence of hunters who knew their prey was cornered. I studied the ruins around us, looking for any advantage the terrain might offer, and spotted what appeared to be the entrance to a root cellar or underground storage area that the expedition had dug beneath one of their larger shelters. The opening was partially concealed by fallen timbers and accumulated snow, but it might provide temporary refuge if we could reach it without being seen by our pursuers. Tommy proved his worth again by helping me clear debris from the entrance while Sarah kept watch, the leather pouch pressed against her chest like armor that could somehow protect her from the bullets that would surely follow if we were discovered. The cellar was cramped and dark, barely large enough for 4 people, but it was shelter from the wind and concealment from the eyes of men who wanted us dead. As we squeezed into the narrow space, I realized we were sharing this hiding place. With the bones of expedition members who had probably died in this very spot, their skeletal remains a grim reminder of what awaited us if we failed to escape. Baba, children pressed close together in the suffocating darkness, their breathing the only sound besides the distant voices of our hunters and the wind that whistled through the ruins above us. But it was what Tommy found clutched in the bony fingers of one skeleton that made our situation infinitely more dangerous than we had imagined. "Look at this," Tommy whispered, his young voice tight with excitement and terror as he held up a small brass key that matched the one Sarah had given me almost exactly. The 2 keys were clearly a pair, designed to work together to open something that required both pieces for access. And I realized we had stumbled upon the ultimate security measure employed by the Russian expedition to protect their treasure. Sarah's eyes widened as she understood the implications. Her father had found only half of what was needed to claim the hidden fortune, and the other half had been buried here with the expedition's dead for 40 years. The leather pouch she carried so protectively contained maps and documents that were useless without the second key, explaining why Volkov was so desperate to capture them alive rather than simply killing them and taking the papers by force. Above us, the voices of our pursuers grew louder as they began to search the ruins more systematically, their footsteps crunching through snow and debris as they looked for signs of our passage. I could hear Volkov himself calling orders in Russian, his voice sharp with frustration as he realized we had vanished into the wilderness like ghosts fleeing from their own graves. The darkness of our hiding place felt oppressive, heavy with the smell of decay and the weight of secrets that had cost so many lives over the decades. Little Beth began to whimper softly, the sound barely audible but loud enough to make my heart race with the fear of discovery. But it was the sudden silence above us that told me our hunters had found something that changed the nature of their search entirely. The footsteps stopped directly overhead, followed by voices speaking in urgent Russian that I couldn't understand but whose tone conveyed shock and recognition. Through gaps in the debris above us, I could see the flickering light of torches as Volkov's men examined the ruins with new interest, their casual hunt suddenly becoming something more purposeful and deadly. Sarah gripped both keys now, the brass metal warming in her small hands as she understood that we possessed something that could unlock secrets worth killing for, if we lived long enough to use them. The sound of wood being moved and debris being cleared told me that our hunters were no longer simply tracking us, but were beginning to excavate the expedition site with the methodical precision of men who knew exactly what they were looking for. Tommy pressed his eye to a crack in our hiding place's ceiling, watching the activity above with the intensity of a scout gathering intelligence for a desperate battle. "They found the grave marker," he whispered back to us, his voice barely audible in the cramped space. "Volkov is reading something from a book and he looks scared." The idea that anything could frighten a man who murdered families for profit sent chills down my spine deeper than any Arctic wind. Above us, the sound of digging began in earnest, shovels biting into frozen earth as the killers searched for something among the expedition's remains. But it was the conversation I managed to overhear between Volkov and one of his men that revealed the true scope of the nightmare we had stumbled into. The old man was my grandfather. Volkov's voice carried clearly through the cold air, his Russian accent thick with emotion I couldn't identify. He died here protecting secrets that should have made our family rich beyond imagination, but the cowards buried everything rather than fight for what was rightfully ours. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place as I realized we weren't dealing with random claim jumpers or simple bandits, but with the descendant of the original Russian expedition, a man whose family history was tied to the treasure through blood and betrayal spanning 2 generations. Sarah's father had unknowingly uncovered a legacy of greed that stretched back to the sale of Alaska itself, discovering documents that revealed not just the location of hidden wealth, but the true identity of those who had died protecting it. The sound of metal striking metal rang through the night air as Volkov's men uncovered something buried in the expedition's ruins, their excited voices suggesting they had found more than just bones and broken equipment. Tommy continued his surveillance, whispering updates that painted a picture of systematic excavation and growing desperation among our hunters. "They're arguing about something," he reported. "One man wants to keep digging, but Volkov keeps looking at the sky like he's worried about the weather." The wind was indeed picking up again, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of another blizzard that could trap us all in this graveyard of Russian dreams. But it was the sound of Sarah's sharp intake of breath that told me our hiding place had been discovered by something far more dangerous than human enemies. Yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness beyond our makeshift shelter, reflecting the torchlight. From above, as a pack of real wolves emerged from the forest to investigate the disturbance in their territory. The animals moved with predatory grace through the ruins, their gray forms ghostly in the flickering light as they assessed both the humans above and the prey hidden below. Sarah pressed her hand over Little Beth's mouth to muffle any sound, while Tommy and I remained frozen as the lead wolf approached our hiding spot with curiosity that could quickly turn deadly. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were hiding from human wolves only to be discovered by the genuine article, creatures whose hunger was honest compared to the greed that drove our pursuers. Above us, Volkov's men began to notice the pack's approach, their digging slowing as they realized they were no longer the only predators in the expedition's ruins. The wolves seemed unafraid of the humans, suggesting they had encountered people before and found them either harmless or simply another source of food in the harsh wilderness. One animal, A massive male with scars across his muzzle sniffed at the entrance to our hiding place, his intelligent eyes studying us with an assessment that felt disturbingly human. The children remained perfectly still, understanding instinctively. That movement meant death, whether from fang or bullet. While above us, the voices of our hunters took on new urgency as they debated whether to continue their search or retreat from the growing wolf pack. But it was the sound of the storm's approach that made the decision for all of us, human and animal alike. The wind rose to a howl that rivaled the wolves' voices, bringing with it snow that fell so thick it turned the world white within minutes. Volkov's men began to shout over the rising storm, their torches flickering wildly in the gale as they struggled to maintain their excavation in conditions that threatened to bury them alive. The wolves scattered as the blizzard intensified, seeking shelter among the ruins or retreating to dens that offered better protection than the exposed expedition site. Our own hiding place became a mixed blessing as the temperature plummeted and snow began to drift into every crack and opening, threatening to seal us in our makeshift tomb while protecting us from discovery. Sarah clutched both keys against her chest, their metal surfaces so cold they burned her skin, while the leather pouch seemed to pulse with its own dark energy in the cramped confines of our shelter. Above us, the sounds of human activity became muffled and distant, as Volkov's men were forced to abandon their search and seek shelter from nature's fury. Tommy whispered that he could no longer see torchlight through the gaps in our ceiling, suggesting that our hunters had either fled or been buried by the rapidly accumulating snow. Little Beth had stopped shivering, which worried me more than her earlier fear, because I knew that was often the first sign of hypothermia setting in among children exposed to extreme cold. But it was the sound of Sarah's teeth chattering that reminded me we faced a race against time where exposure could kill us just as efficiently as bullets. The storm raged with supernatural fury, turning our hiding place into a cave of ice as snow packed against every opening and the temperature dropped to levels that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Our breath created clouds of vapor that immediately turned to ice crystals, coating the walls of our shelter with a layer of frost that made the space feel even smaller and more claustrophobic. Sarah's lips were turning blue despite her efforts to stay warm, and I knew that all of us were beginning to succumb to the cold that had claimed so many lives in this unforgiving territory. The keys she held had become so cold they stuck to her skin, but she refused to let go of them even as frostbite threatened her fingers. Tommy tried to keep little Beth warm by wrapping his arms around her, but I could see that both younger children were losing the battle against hypothermia as their small bodies failed to generate enough heat to survive. The leather pouch had become stiff with cold, its contents probably frozen solid, but it remained our only hope for justice and survival if we could somehow live long enough to reach civilization. Above us, the storm continued with relentless fury, and I realized that nature had become our temporary ally, hiding us from human enemies while simultaneously threatening to kill us with its indifferent embrace. The irony of dying from cold, while hiding from men who wanted to murder us, wasn't lost on me, but I knew that we had to survive this night if the Morrison children were ever to see justice for their parents' deaths. But it was the decision I made in that frozen tomb that would either save us all or damn us to join the bones that already littered this cursed place. "We have to move," I whispered through chattering teeth, knowing that staying in our hiding place meant certain death from exposure, even if it protected us from Volkov's guns. The storm above had reached the intensity where even experienced killers would be forced to seek shelter, giving us a window of opportunity to escape if we had the courage to face nature's wrath. Sarah nodded weakly, understanding that movement was our only chance for survival, while Tommy helped support little Beth, whose small form had grown dangerously limp with advancing hypothermia. The keys felt like pieces of ice in Sarah's hands, but she clutched them with determination that spoke of a will stronger than the cold that threatened to claim her young life. As we prepared to leave our shelter, I realized we were embarking on a journey through a blizzard that could kill us. Within minutes, pursued by enemies who would show no mercy if they found us, carrying secrets that men had died to protect for 40 years. The leather pouch bounced against Sarah's chest as she moved, its contents representing both hope and damnation in a game where the stakes had been raised to include not just treasure, but the very survival of 3 orphaned children and 1 aging Prospector. Above us, the storm screamed with the voices of all who had died in this place. But somewhere beyond the white fury lay the possibility of reaching civilization and the justice that the Morrison family deserved. But first we had to survive a night that promised to test every limit of human endurance against the pitiless fury of an Alaskan blizzard that showed no distinction between the innocent and the guilty. The blizzard had transformed the world into a white hell where every step forward could be our last, the wind cutting through our inadequate clothing like knives made of ice and desperation. We had been walking for hours through snow that reached my waist and came up to little Beth's chest, forcing me to carry her more often than she could walk on her own frozen legs. Sarah led the way with grim determination, the 2 brass keys clutched in her numb fingers while the leather pouch bounced against her chest with each labored step through the drifts. Tommy proved his courage again and again, never complaining despite the frostbite that was claiming his ears and nose, his young face set with resolve that reminded me of soldiers I had known who faced death without flinching. Behind us, somewhere in the white fury, Volkov and his men were probably still searching, their pursuit slowed but not stopped by nature's assault on our frozen landscape. The storm showed no signs of weakening, and I knew that we were walking a razor's edge between escape and death, each mile bringing us closer to either salvation or our final rest in the Alaskan wilderness. My rifle had become almost too cold to handle, the metal burning my skin through my gloves. But I knew that dropping it meant surrendering our only defense against the human wolves that hunted us. But it was the sight that emerged from the swirling snow ahead that made my heart sink with the knowledge that our desperate flight had led us to a place where legends came to die. Dead Man's Pass stretched before us like a gateway to the underworld, its narrow passage between towering cliffs barely visible through the driving snow that seemed to fall upward as much as down. The pass had earned its grim name through decades of claiming travelers who underestimated its dangers. Avalanches that could bury entire expeditions, winds that could freeze a man solid while he still drew breath, and crevasses hidden beneath. Innocent-looking snow that dropped into darkness deeper than any grave. Sarah stared at the forbidding entrance with eyes that held too much fear for someone so young, understanding that crossing meant facing death in its purest form, while staying meant certain capture by killers who would show no mercy. The wind through the pass created sounds like screaming souls, and I could see why native peoples avoided this place even in summer, believing it to be cursed by the spirits of those who had perished in its icy embrace. Tommy studied the treacherous terrain with the tactical mind he had developed too early, pointing out potential hazards and routes that might offer slightly better chances of survival. Little Beth had grown dangerously quiet, her small body conserving energy for a battle against cold that she might not have the strength to win. The brass keys in Sarah's hands had become so cold they were welded to her skin by frost, but she refused to let go of them even as I could see the beginning stages of frostbite claiming her fingers. But it was the sound echoing from behind us that forced the decision none of us wanted to make. The distant barking of sled dogs carried clearly through the storm, telling us that Volkov had organized his pursuit and was closing the distance with mechanical precision despite the blizzard's fury. His men had obviously weathered the worst of the storm and resumed their hunt with the relentless determination of predators who knew their prey was weakening with every hour of exposure to the elements. Sarah's face went white beneath the frost that coated her young features, and I knew she was remembering the night her parents died and the sound of those same dogs approaching the Copper Creek mine. The leather pouch seemed to grow heavier with each barking call, its contents representing not just treasure but the blood price that had already been paid and the additional lives that would be lost before this chase reached its conclusion. Tommy helped support Little Beth as we approached the pass entrance, his young shoulders bearing weight that no child should have to carry in a world where adults had failed to protect the innocent. The walls of the pass rose on either side like the ribs of some massive frozen beast, their surfaces slick with ice that reflected what little light penetrated the storm's fury. I could feel the temperature dropping even further as we entered the narrow corridor, the wind creating a venturi, effect that accelerated the air to speeds that could knock a grown man off his feet. But it was the sight of fresh bones scattered at the pass entrance that reminded us we were following in the footsteps of others who had made this same desperate choice and paid the ultimate price. The bones belonged to a recent traveler, probably someone who had attempted the crossing within the last year, their remains picked clean by scavengers and bleached white by the elements that showed no mercy to those who miscalculated their strength against nature's fury. Sarah knelt beside the skeleton for a moment, her young hands trembling as she found a brass compass that might help us navigate the treacherous passage ahead. The dead man's equipment was scattered around his final resting place, a broken rifle, torn clothing, and supplies that had proven inadequate against the pass's legendary dangers. Tommy discovered a journal wrapped in oiled cloth, its pages documenting the final days of someone named Marcus Webb, who had been fleeing claim jumpers, with a bag of gold that had cost him everything he held dear. The parallels to our own situation were too obvious to ignore, and I realized we were reading the last words of a man who had faced the same impossible choice between human enemies and natural death. Little Beth pointed at something glinting, in the snow near the skeleton's ribs, a small brass key that looked remarkably similar to the two Sarah already carried. The discovery sent chills through my body that had nothing to do with the Arctic wind, because I was beginning to understand that we had stumbled into a pattern of treasure and death that stretched back generations. The sound of approaching dogs grew louder, more urgent, and I knew that Volkov was gaining ground while we stood among the bones of someone who had died carrying secrets remarkably similar to our own. But it was the avalanche warning that Webb had written in his final journal entry that made me realize our problems were about to multiply beyond anything we had yet faced. "The snow is unstable," I read from Webb's final entry, his handwriting growing increasingly erratic as cold and desperation took their toll. Any loud sound could bring down enough snow to bury the pass for months. The implications hit me like a physical blow as I realized that Volkov's pursuit, complete with barking, dogs and shouting men, could trigger the very disaster that would solve our immediate problem while creating an entirely new set of challenges. Sarah understood immediately, her young mind grasping tactical possibilities that spoke of intelligence beyond her years, and I could see her calculating whether we could use the avalanche danger to our advantage. The walls of the pass towered. Above us, their surfaces loaded with snow that had accumulated through multiple storms, held in place by nothing more than luck and the absence of disturbance. Tommy studied the terrain with growing excitement, pointing out areas where the snow overhang looked particularly unstable, places where even a rifle shot might be enough to bring down tons of frozen death on anyone unfortunate enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The barking of Volkov's dogs was getting closer, echoing off the pass walls in a way that seemed to make the very snow tremble with anticipation. Little Beth had grown so cold that her lips were turning blue, but her eyes remained alert as she sensed the change in our situation from desperate flight to potential ambush. But it was the sound of voices speaking Russian. That told me our hunters had reached the pass entrance and were about to walk into a trap that nature had been preparing for decades. Volkov's voice carried clearly through the narrow passage as he ordered his men to spread out and search for our tracks, his Russian accent thick with confidence that spoke of a man who believed victory was within his grasp. I positioned the children behind a large boulder that offered some protection from both bullets and avalanche debris, while I took up a position where I could observe our enemies without being seen. The brass keys that Sarah clutched had begun to warm slightly from her body heat, and I could see determination replacing fear in her young eyes as she realized we finally had a chance to strike back at the man who had murdered her family. Tommy kept little Beth warm with his own body heat while maintaining watch on the unstable snow above us, his tactical instincts telling him exactly when and where to create the disturbance that would bring justice raining down from the sky. Through the swirling snow, I could see the dark forms of Volkov's men as they entered the pass, their sled dogs excited by our scent trail and their voices echoing off the walls with dangerous volume. The leather pouch bounced gently against Sarah's chest as she breathed, its contents representing not just treasure, but the power to end a cycle of violence that had claimed too many innocent lives. I checked my rifle one final time, knowing that timing would be everything in the next few minutes, that success meant survival while failure meant joining the bones that already littered this cursed passage. But it was Sarah's whispered words that told me these children had found strength I never knew they possessed. "For Mama and Papa," she breathed, her young voice carrying the weight of justice delayed but not denied. The sound of Volkov's men grew louder as they advanced through the pass, their boots crunching on snow that had been packed down by countless previous travelers, most of whom had never emerged from the other side. I could hear the killer himself, calling orders to his men, his voice sharp with authority, and the anticipation of finally cornering the prey that had led him on such a costly chase through the wilderness. The dogs were barking with increasing excitement as they caught stronger scent traces, their calls echoing off the pass walls with volume that made me wince and hope the snow above us would hold just a little longer. Tommy had positioned himself where he could see the most unstable section of the overhang, his young hands ready to throw rocks or shout if my rifle shot wasn't enough to trigger the avalanche we needed. Little Beth pressed close to her siblings, her small body shivering with cold and anticipation as she sensed that the long chase was finally approaching its climax. The brass keys felt warm in Sarah's hands now, warmed by determination and the heat of righteous anger that burned hotter than any fire in her young heart. Through gaps in the swirling snow, I could see Volkov himself, a tall man with the bearing of someone accustomed to command and violence, his face hard with the kind of cruelty that made murder seem like simple business. But it was the moment, when he looked up at the unstable snow above him, that I knew the time for justice had finally arrived. My rifle shot cracked through the pass like thunder, the sound bouncing off the walls and amplifying into a roar that seemed to wake the very mountains from their slumber. For a heartbeat, everything hung suspended, the echo of gunfire, the surprised shouts of Volkov's men, the sudden silence of dogs who sensed danger they couldn't understand. Then the snow began to move, slowly at first, just a whisper of white, dust falling like flour from an overturned sack, followed by chunks the size of boulders that crashed down with earth-shaking force. The avalanche built momentum with terrifying speed, tons of accumulated snow breaking free from the pass walls and roaring downward with the fury of nature finally unleashed after months of patient waiting. Volkov's men scattered like ants before. A flood, their shouts of alarm lost in the thunderous roar of descending death, while their sled dogs howled with terror as they realized they were trapped in a passage that had become a tomb. Sarah watched with grim satisfaction as justice finally caught up with the man who had destroyed her family, the brass keys clutched in her hands like talismans of victory. The leather pouch bounced against her chest as the ground shook beneath. Our feet, its contents safe, while the men who would have killed for them were buried beneath tons of snow and ice. Tommy cheered as the avalanche reached its peak fury, while little Beth pressed her face against my coat to avoid seeing the destruction. That would haunt her dreams for years to come. But it was the sight of Volkov himself, caught in the open when the snow began to fall, that gave me a satisfaction deeper than any gold I had ever pulled from Alaskan streams. The avalanche lasted only minutes, but when the snow finally settled, and the echoes faded, Dead Man's Pass had been transformed into a white cemetery that stretched for hundreds of yards. Where Volkov and his men had stood, nothing remained but pristine snow that would hide their bodies until spring melt revealed the price of greed and murder in this unforgiving land. Sarah stared at the peaceful scene with eyes that held both relief and the terrible understanding that justice, when it finally came, often arrived wearing the mask of tragedy. The brass keys in her hands felt lighter now, no longer weighted with the blood of her parents, but freed to unlock secrets that could honor their memory instead of avenging their deaths. Tommy helped little Beth to her feet, his young face serious, as he realized they had witnessed something that would change them forever, marking the moment when childhood innocence finally surrendered to the harsh realities of an adult world. The leather pouch no longer represented danger, but hope, its contents promising a future where 3 orphaned children might find safety and the means to build new lives from the ashes of their old ones. I shouldered my rifle and began leading them toward the far end of the pass, where civilization and safety lay beyond the reach of men who viewed murder as simply another form of business transaction. The storm was finally beginning to weaken, and patches of blue sky showed through. The clouds like promises of better days ahead for children who had endured more than any young soul should have to bear. But it was the knowledge that we still carried secrets worth killing, for that reminded me our journey toward safety was far from over, and that other predators might be waiting beyond the white silence of Dead Man's Pass. 3 weeks later, as we stood before the imposing brick facade of Merchants Bank in Fairbanks, the 3 brass keys felt like pieces of destiny in our frost-scarred hands. The journey from Dead Man's Pass had been a testament to human endurance. 3 orphaned children and 1 aging prospector walking through a landscape that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared, sustained only by the hope that justice and treasure lay waiting in a steel box marked 47. Sarah had grown quiet during our travels, the weight of survival and loss aging her young face beyond her 12 years, while Tommy and little Beth clung to each other with the desperate love of siblings who had lost everything except each other. The leather pouch had never left Sarah's side, its contents representing not just maps and documents, but the blood-bought legacy of parents who had died protecting secrets that could change their children's lives forever. I had sold my few remaining possessions to buy the children proper winter clothing and secure passage on the mail sledge that brought us to civilization, watching their young faces transform with wonder as they saw electric lights and heated buildings for the first time in weeks. The bank manager, a portly man named Henderson, studied our odd group with curiosity and suspicion, probably wondering what business children and a rough prospector could have with safety deposit boxes that required such elaborate security measures. But it was the moment when Sarah placed all 3 brass keys on his polished desk that I saw recognition and fear flicker across his well-fed features. Box 47. Henderson repeated slowly, his voice carrying the weight of secrets he had been paid to keep but never expected to confront. The keys gleamed on his desk like pieces of puzzle that had taken 40 years to assemble, their brass surfaces reflecting the electric lights that seemed impossibly bright after our weeks in the wilderness. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she watched the banker examine each key with growing alarm, understanding that whatever lay in that steel box represented either salvation or damnation for 3 children who had already lost too much. Tommy and little Beth pressed close to their older sister, their young faces grave with anticipation as they prepared to learn the full truth about the legacy their parents had died to protect. The leather pouch sat open on Henderson's desk, revealing documents written in Russian and English that detailed treasures buried throughout Alaska before the territory's sale to America in 1867. I could see the banker's eyes widening as he read William Morrison's notations and maps, probably calculating the enormous wealth that these simple papers represented to anyone brave enough to claim it. The electric heater in Henderson's office felt like luxury beyond description after our ordeal in the frozen wilderness, but I knew that warmth and safety were temporary gifts that could be snatched away if we mishandled the revelations ahead. But it was the question Henderson asked that confirmed my suspicions about the true scope of what we had stumbled into. "Where did you get the third key?" the banker asked, his voice tight with anxiety that spoke of secrets he had hoped would remain buried forever. Sarah explained about finding it with Marcus Webb's, remains at Dead Man's Pass, her young voice steady as she described details that made Henderson's face grow pale beneath his carefully groomed mustache. The banker's hands shook slightly as he examined Webb's key, and I realized we were looking at a man who had been part of a conspiracy that stretched back decades, possibly involving multiple banks and safety deposit boxes throughout Alaska and the Northwest Territory. Tommy proved his sharp mind again by asking why the bank had kept Box 47 available for so many years without payment, a question that made Henderson fidget with his collar and avoid meeting our eyes directly. The leather pouch seemed to pulse with dark energy as more secrets emerged, revealing that William Morrison hadn't been the first person to discover evidence of the Russian treasure, but merely the latest in a long line of prospectors who had found pieces of a puzzle that someone had been determined to keep scattered. Little Beth spoke up with the innocent clarity that only children possess, asking why the banker looked so scared if we were just opening a box that belonged to them by right of inheritance. Henderson's reaction to her question told me everything. I needed to know about the corruption that had kept this treasure hidden while innocent people died trying to claim what was rightfully theirs. But it was the sound of footsteps in the bank's outer office that made me realize our problems were far from over. The footsteps belonged to 3 men in expensive suits who carried themselves with the authority of those accustomed to power and violence, their cold eyes studying our little group with the calculating interest of predators sizing up prey. Henderson's relief at their arrival was obvious and immediate, telling me that these weren't random customers but allies he had summoned to deal with a situation that threatened whatever conspiracy had kept Box 47 sealed for 4 decades. Sarah instinctively clutched the keys closer to her chest, her young mind understanding that we faced a new threat that might prove more dangerous than Volkov's crude violence. The lead man, tall and well-dressed with silver hair and predatory eyes, introduced himself as Jonathan Blackwood, senior partner in a law firm that represented certain interests in territorial development and resource management. His voice carried the smooth menace of someone who destroyed lives with contracts and corruption rather than bullets, but I could see the same cold cruelty in his gaze that had marked Volkov as a killer. Tommy and Little Beth moved closer to me, their instincts warning them that these well-dressed enemies might prove more dangerous than the rough men who had murdered their parents. The leather pouch seemed to grow heavier as Blackwood's eyes fixed on it with obvious hunger, and I realized we had stumbled into a web of greed and conspiracy that reached far beyond simple claim jumping or territorial disputes. But it was Blackwood's next words that revealed the true scope of the forces arrayed against 3 orphaned children and their makeshift guardian. "Those documents belong to the Russian-American Development Company," Blackwood declared with the authority of someone accustomed to having his pronouncements accepted without question. "Any attempt to access assets described in those papers constitutes theft of corporate property and will be prosecuted to the full extent of territorial law." His words carried the weight of legal threats backed by political power, and I understood that we faced enemies who could destroy us through courts and contracts as efficiently as Volkov had tried to do with bullets and violence. Sarah's young face hardened with determination that reminded me of her father's courage, and she stepped forward with the keys held prominently in her small hands. "These keys belong to my papa and mama," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the bank's marble floors with surprising strength. "They died protecting what was rightfully ours, and no fancy words are going to steal it from us now." Henderson tried to intervene with nervous platitudes about legal procedures and proper documentation, but Blackwood silenced him with a gesture that spoke of absolute authority over the banker's actions. The leather pouch's contents, suddenly, represented more than treasure. They were evidence of a conspiracy that had cost multiple lives while enriching men who viewed murder as simply another business expense. Tommy proved his tactical brilliance by quietly noting the positions of Blackwood's associates, understanding that these well-dressed killers were preparing for violence despite their civilized appearance. But it was Little Beth's innocent question that cut through the legal threats and revealed the truth about what we really faced. "Why are you trying to steal from orphans?" she asked, with the devastating honesty that only children can deliver, her small voice echoing in the bank's marble chamber like an accusation that no legal maneuvering could deflect. Blackwood's smooth facade cracked slightly at her words, revealing the predatory nature beneath his cultured exterior, while his associates shifted positions in ways that suggested they were preparing for violence if legal intimidation failed. Sarah used the moment of distraction to insert all 3 keys into Box 47's complex locking mechanism, her young fingers working with desperate speed as she raced to claim her family's legacy before corporate wolves could steal it through legal theft. The sound of tumblers falling into place echoed through the bank like gunshots, and I knew that whatever lay in that steel box would determine whether justice prevailed or whether 3 children would lose their final connection to parents who had died protecting them. Henderson made a move toward the box, but I stepped between him and the children, my hand resting on the grip of my rifle in a gesture that needed no translation. The banker's face went white as he realized that his comfortable corruption had led him into a situation where violence might be the only resolution, where his alliance with corporate predators could cost him his life. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he calculated the odds of taking the box's contents by force, his legal threats, giving way to more primitive considerations of risk and reward. But it was what Sarah found inside Box 47 that changed everything we thought we knew about the treasure and the conspiracy that had protected it. The box contained more than documents and maps. It held a confession written in William Morrison's careful handwriting that detailed decades of conspiracy, murder, and theft perpetrated by the Russian-American Development Company and their allies in territorial government. Sarah's hands trembled as she read her father's words, learning that he had discovered not just one treasure, but evidence of multiple caches hidden throughout Alaska, each one representing wealth that had been stolen from native peoples and legitimate. Prospectors through a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial administration. The confession named names, provided dates, and detailed crimes that could destroy reputations and end careers throughout the Alaska Territory, making it worth far more than any buried gold to men who had built their fortunes on blood and betrayal. Tommy and Little Beth listened with growing amazement as their sister read passages that revealed their father as a far more complex figure than they had known. Not just a simple prospector, but an investigator who had spent years gathering evidence against a conspiracy that had cost countless lives. Blackwood's face went ashen as he heard details of crimes he had obviously participated in, understanding that the box contained enough evidence to hang him and his associates if it ever reached honest authorities. The leather pouch, suddenly, seemed insignificant compared to the explosive revelations contained in Morrison's carefully documented testimony, evidence that could bring justice not just for one murdered family, but for decades of victims. Henderson tried to edge toward the door, but one of Blackwood's men blocked his path, making it clear that no one would leave until the situation was resolved to their satisfaction. But it was the final document in the box that provided the solution. None of us had expected. The document was a will, properly witnessed and legally binding, that left everything: treasure maps, evidence of conspiracy, and the authority to pursue justice to William Morrison's 3 children, with specific instructions that the evidence should be delivered to Judge Samuel Warren in Seattle, the one territorial official Morrison had trusted to act on the explosive revelations. Sarah's young face glowed with triumph as she realized her father had anticipated this moment, planning for a confrontation that would either vindicate his life's work or provide his children with the means to claim justice after his death. Blackwood made a desperate grab for the documents, but I was ready for him, my rifle barrel pressing against his ribs with enough force to make him reconsider his priorities. "These children have legal ownership of everything in this box," I said quietly, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen enough violence to recognize when it was necessary. "And if anything happens to them or these documents, copies have already been sent to authorities in Seattle and Washington who are expecting a full report." It was a bluff, but the fear in Blackwood's eyes told me he couldn't afford to test its validity. Henderson collapsed into his chair, understanding that his comfortable corruption had finally caught up with him and that his only hope lay in cooperating with the law rather than fighting it. Tommy and little Beth pressed close to their sister, their young faces shining with pride as they realized their parents' sacrifice had not been in vain. But it was the sound of approaching footsteps that announced the arrival of salvation in the form of territorial marshals who had been summoned by a telegraph message I had sent upon our arrival in Fairbanks. The marshals entered the bank with drawn weapons and warrants that had been issued based on preliminary evidence I had provided about the murders at Copper Creek Mine, their presence transforming Blackwood and his associates from predators into prey in the span of heartbeats. Sarah handed over copies of her father's confession with the dignity of someone far older than her 12 years, watching with satisfaction as handcuffs were placed on the men who had tried to steal her family's legacy through legal theft and intimidation. The leather pouch and its contents were logged as evidence in multiple murder cases, but the children retained copies of the treasure maps that would allow them to claim wealth that was rightfully theirs by inheritance and discovery. Henderson babbled confessions and pleas for mercy as he was led away in chains, his comfortable corruption finally exposed to the light of justice that William Morrison had died trying to bring to Alaska territory. Tommy and little Beth watched the arrests with wide eyes, understanding that they were witnessing the end of a nightmare that had begun with their parents' murder and the beginning of a new life built on justice rather than fear. The bank's marble floors echoed with the footsteps of departing prisoners, while the 3 brass keys lay on Henderson's desk like symbols of a puzzle finally solved after 4 decades of waiting. I found myself thinking about the Russian traders who had started this chain of events, wondering if they could have imagined that their hidden treasure would eventually bring justice to children born generations after their own deaths. But it was Sarah's words as we prepared to leave the bank that reminded me why some treasures are worth more than gold. "Papa always said that truth was worth more than money," she whispered, clutching her father's confession against her chest like the precious thing it had become. The morning sun streamed through the bank's windows, casting long shadows that seemed to represent the ghosts of all who had died protecting secrets that were finally free to serve justice rather than greed. Tommy and little Beth flanked their older sister, their young faces marked by loss, but brightened by hope for a future that their parents' sacrifice had finally made possible. The treasure maps they carried would provide them with financial security, but it was the evidence of their father's courage that would sustain them through the years ahead, proving that some people chose to fight corruption even when it cost them everything. I realized that my own role as their protector was ending, not because they no longer needed guidance, but because they had found the strength to honor their parents' memory through their own courage and determination. The leather pouch had served its purpose, carrying secrets through wilderness and violence until they could be delivered to those with the power to act on them, transforming from a burden into a gift that would echo through generations. Outside the bank, Fairbanks bustled with the energy of a growing city, full of opportunities for 3 children who now possessed both the means and the moral authority to build lives worthy of the parents who had died protecting them. But it was the knowledge that justice had finally prevailed that made the cold Alaska air feel warm with promise and the possibility of redemption. The ghosts of dead man's past could rest in peace, knowing that their secrets had served not greed, but the cause of right, while 3 orphaned children walked into a future bright with the gold of honest achievement and the satisfaction of promises kept to the dead.